I arrived in Recife on a sticky March afternoon, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The taxi from the airport weaved through wide avenues and narrow back streets, past colorful houses and walls covered in faded graffiti. The city felt both alive and indifferent to my presence. I pressed my forehead to the window, trying to memorize the palm trees, the unfamiliar shops, the faces on the sidewalks, reminding myself that this was really happening. Back in Germany, everyone said I was running away. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't stand another night in that old apartment, hearing the neighbors fight and the tram screeching past every hour. In Brazil, at least, no one knew my story. No one expected anything. The Airbnb I chose was a modest studio tucked behind a bright yellow gate on a street that Google Maps described as Residenciale Tranquila. Marta, the owner, sent me long voice messages full of warmth and practical tips. How to work the shower, where to buy pau de queijo, what to avoid after dark. The key was in a small lockbox beside the entrance. The building itself was older than it looked online, paint flaking, gate squeaking, but the air smelled clean and sweet with jasmine and distant ocean. Inside, the space felt compact but welcoming. There was a little kitchenette with chipped blue tiles, a faded couch, and a narrow bed pressed against the wall under a ceiling fan. The only window looked out over a dense tangle of tropical plants, and just beyond, the blank concrete wall of another building. I dropped my bag on the bed, kicked off my shoes, and tried to let the silence settle inside me. Marta had left a basket of local snacks, cocada, cashew nuts, a tiny bottle of cachaça, and a handwritten note on the counter. Bem-vindo, relaxe, aproveite. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. I spent the afternoon unpacking, pacing from window to window, getting used to the way the place sounded when empty. The hum of the fridge, the distant echo of traffic, the irregular drip of water in the bathroom sink. Every so often, voices floated in from the street, muted by the thick walls. I made tea, stood by the window, and watched the light change as clouds gathered overhead. By dusk, the neighborhood quieted. The only regular noise was the yapping of a small dog somewhere near. When darkness fell, I double-checked the locks, tested the Wi-Fi, and tried to settle into the unfamiliar bed. I could hear the slow, rhythmic beat of my own pulse in my ears, amplified by the hush around me. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages, then set it aside. I thought I might finally sleep through the night, but just as I was drifting off, heart slowing, breathing deep, a faint metallic clink broke through the silence. It came from outside the front door, sharper and more deliberate than the sounds of the building settling. I sat up, listening hard. There was a long pause, then another softer clink. The lockbox? My mind ran through the checklist of explanations. A neighbor, Marta herself, someone from another apartment. But no one had mentioned anyone else living here. I waited, holding my breath, trying to catch the rhythm of footsteps or a voice. All I heard was the city's distant hum, the tick of the kitchen clock, the soft mechanical click of the fridge cycling on. The noise didn't repeat. After a minute, I got up, peered through the peephole, and saw nothing but the yellow gate and a slick of wet pavement under the street lamp. I tried to laugh it off, but when I lay back down, I left the bedside light on and pressed my bag against the door. Just in case. By morning, the unease had faded, replaced by the relief of sunlight and the sound of a new city waking up outside. The second day began with a dull gray sky and a sticky humidity that never seemed to lift. I woke up groggy, the memory of the metallic clink still fresh in my head, echoing in the empty space every time the apartment fell silent. Determined to brush it off, I made a strong pot of coffee and stood by the window, watching condensation form little rivers down the glass. Most of the morning passed in a fog of work. I answered emails, fixed a broken spreadsheet, and tried to keep my thoughts from drifting back to the door. But every time I paused, even just to stretch or refill my cup, I found myself glancing at the entrance. half expecting to see a slip of paper or a footprint, something that would prove I hadn't just imagined the night before. Around noon, I decided to step outside for a quick walk and clear my head. The neighborhood was oddly quiet for a weekday, a delivery man chatting with the doorman across the street, the low hum of a distant lawnmower, someone's radio playing for nobody in particular. When I passed the yellow gate, I checked the lockbox again. The numbers were still lined up the way Marta had left them, the metal box cool and solid in my hand, nothing out of place, no sign that anyone had touched it. That afternoon, rain clouds gathered and the air inside felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my shoulders. I cooked something simple, rice and beans, a habit I was trying to pick up, and set my phone on the counter, listening to the neighborhood wind down. As dusk fell, I noticed the old bicycle leaning against the wall across the alley. It hadn't been there yesterday. After dinner, I washed the dishes, slowly, deliberately stretching the routine. Every sound, the tap of the spoon on the sink, the gurgle of the pipes, seemed amplified in the apartment's smallness. I kept thinking about the night before, the click that had jolted me awake, the way my chest had tightened with the sudden, inexplicable certainty that I wasn't alone. When darkness settled in, I went through my new routine, checked the lockbox, tested the door, looked out the window. The street lamp outside flickered, casting odd shadows on the wet pavement. I watched the alley for a long time, convinced I'd see someone appear from behind the concrete wall or from beneath the tangle of power lines. But the alley remained empty save for the bicycle and a scattering of fallen leaves. Just after midnight, as I was turning off the kitchen light, I heard it again, the unmistakable clink of metal against metal, this time louder and more deliberate. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, afraid to move. The sound came in 3 short bursts. Then, a scraping noise like something being dragged slowly across the tile outside my door. I grabbed my phone, thumb hovering over the record button, but didn't dare pull back the curtain or make a sound. I stood there in the dark, counting my own breaths, willing the noise to stop. It did, eventually, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the city drifting in from the window. In the morning, I forced myself to go outside and check. There was a faint smear on the tile just outside the door, gray, dusty, like someone had scuffed their shoe or dragged something heavy. The lockbox looked undisturbed, its surface glistening with dew. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But that evening, after coming back from a walk, I checked the lockbox one more time, just to be sure. The spare key was gone. I spent most of the next day in a state of uneasy anticipation. Every little sound, pipes rattling in the wall, the creak of the ceiling fan, footsteps from the apartment above, seemed loaded with meaning, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than nerves and jet lag, but that gnawing awareness stayed with me, growing heavier as the afternoon faded into evening. Before sunset, I finally texted Marta, my fingers shaking slightly as I tried to frame the message in a way that didn't make me sound paranoid. Hi, Marta. Quick question. Does anyone else have access to the apartment or the lockbox? I noticed the spare key is missing. She responded faster than I expected. Her reply was reassuring but also strangely alarming in its certainty. No one should have access. I'm out of town and you're the only guest. I'll check with the cleaner, but it's probably nothing. Just keep both locks secured and let me know if you hear anything else. I thanked her and promised I'd stay alert, but the words did little to quiet the tension coiling in my chest. I tried to distract myself, watched a movie, called my sister back in Berlin, scrolled through social media until my eyes blurred. But as the city outside grew darker, the silence inside the apartment became oppressive. The kitchen light felt too bright, so I turned it off and sat in the dim blue glow of my laptop. Shadows lengthened on the walls, and every shift in the wind outside made me glance up, searching for movement beyond the glass. At 12:42 a.m., just as I was convincing myself to finally try to sleep, the apartment's buzzer rang. The sound was flat and drawn out, echoing down the hallway and freezing me in place. I waited, breath shallow, then tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The corridor was empty. No footsteps, no voices, nothing but the distant drip of water in the stairwell. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to catch any sign of life beyond the door, but the only thing I heard was my own heart pounding. Unsure what else to do, I started recording a voice memo on my phone. Mostly silence, punctuated by my nervous breathing and the refrigerator's soft whir. I left the phone running as I sat by the window, watching the alley below. The street lamp flickered, making the world outside pulse with brief bursts of color. A long while passed. I couldn't bring myself to go back to bed. When dawn finally bled into the room, I cracked open the door and looked down. There, just under the edge of the doormat, was a folded slip of paper. My first thought was that it was a receipt or a flyer, something blown in by the wind. But when I picked it up, I saw the handwriting. Shaky, uneven, as if written by someone in a hurry or with trembling hands. In Portuguese, the message read, "Ancion cuidado com, a chave extra. Voce now. Be careful with the spare key. You are not alone." I stood in the doorway for a long time, the paper growing damp in my palm. My first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss it as a weird prank or a note meant for someone else, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I closed the door, locked both bolts, and placed the note on the kitchen table where I could see it. For the rest of the morning, every sound in the apartment, every whisper of the wind, every click of the pipes felt loaded with meaning. I left a lamp on in every room and didn't sleep at all. The day after finding the note passed in a restless, suspended sort of limbo. I tried to lose myself in my usual routine, answering work emails, making endless cups of coffee, tidying up small messes that didn't need cleaning. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my mind kept drifting back to the slip of paper now sitting on the kitchen table, and the chill that had settled over the apartment since the night before. By late afternoon, the sky darkened with heavy clouds and a sticky drizzle began tapping at the window. The apartment felt colder than usual, even though the air was thick and wet. I moved around the small space, double-checking every lock, the front door, the window latch, even the lockbox outside. My hands trembled each time I tested the bolts, as if I expected to find them turned or broken. I kept replaying Marta's message in my head, searching for some reassurance that I'd misunderstood, that there was an easy answer. When dusk fell, the power flickered, then steadied. I set my phone to charge by the bed, filled a glass of water, and wedged my suitcase up against the front door. The chair from the kitchenette joined it, anything to give me a sense of control, even if only symbolic. Around 1 a.m., just as the apartment settled into its deepest quiet, the power flickered again. The hum of the refrigerator cut out, leaving a sudden silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, the green emergency LED over the door blinked to life, throwing a ghostly light across the tile floor. I sat frozen on the bed, gripping my phone and listening, first to the silence, then to a series of sounds from the alley outside. A soft shuffle like someone moving slowly and carefully over wet pavement. A faint thump, muffled by the walls. Then, the unmistakable scrape of metal against tile, longer and more deliberate than before. I wanted to get up and check the window, but fear kept me rooted in place. Instead, I listened, counting my breaths, tracking every noise as if it might explain the growing dread inside me. The sounds faded as suddenly as they'd begun. When the lights snapped back on, everything looked exactly the same, except for one small, impossible detail. The window at the back, which I always kept locked, now stood open by just a crack, letting in a thin ribbon of damp, cold air. I approached slowly, heart hammering, and pressed my palm against the glass. The window creaked but held firm when I pushed it shut again. Turning back toward the kitchen, I saw something else out of place. The slip of paper from before, now unfolded and resting in the center of the table, blank. I stared at it, feeling the prickle of sweat on my back despite the chill. I hadn't touched the note since the morning. I was sure I'd left it folded. For a moment, I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living space, staring at the paper and the newly shut window, wondering if I'd missed something, if the apartment itself was working against me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay awake, listening to the city beyond the walls and the slow ticking of the clock, waiting for the sun to rise. I spent the next morning in a daze, moving through the apartment as if sleepwalking. Every surface seemed to hold a residue of the night before. The faint chill near the window, the slip of paper still blank and motionless on the table, the musty smell of rain-soaked concrete drifting through the open vent. I couldn't bring myself to touch the note. Instead, I circled it warily, packing my bag in slow, measured movements. I'd already decided to leave. I messaged Marta as soon as the sun rose, telling her I needed a few days away for work and would check back in after the weekend. She replied with her usual warmth, adding a little sun emoji at the end, but I could tell she thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment itself was closing in around me, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I took only what I could carry in a single backpack: laptop, a change of clothes, my passport. The rest I left behind, including the groceries I'd bought that first day and the snacks Marta had left as a welcome. Before leaving, I stood for a long moment by the window, looking down into the tangled plants below and the narrow alley beyond. The world looked unchanged, indifferent, but when I pressed my hand against the glass, I noticed it. A faint, greasy outline of a palm larger than mine smudged on the lower pane. I wiped it away with my sleeve, heart pounding, as if erasing the print would undo the last few nights. I locked the door behind me and placed the spare key back in the lockbox, forcing myself not to look back as I crossed the courtyard and stepped into the bright, humid morning. The street outside was already alive with the buzz of mopeds, the shouts of children on their way to school, a dog barking somewhere nearby. The normality felt thin, like a skin stretched over something darker. I called a car to take me across town to a cheap hotel and kept checking the rear-view mirror as we drove away, half expecting to see the yellow gate receding into the distance or a figure standing in the alley watching. My phone buzzed as we pulled up to the hotel. The notification was from an unknown number, no text, just an image attached. When I opened it, my breath caught. The photo showed my apartment door from the inside. My suitcase, the one I'd left by the entrance, was still there, angled exactly as I'd left it. But in the corner of the image, almost out of frame, I could see a set of keys, different from mine, resting on the floor beside the wall. Their metallic surface glinted in the low morning light, as if someone had just placed them there. For a long time, I stared at the image, trying to piece together some logical explanation. An old photo, a prank, a trick of the camera, but deep down I knew it wasn't any of those things. I left the hotel room curtains open that night, watching the streetlights flicker, listening for the sound of metal against metal, and wondering if the apartment would ever truly let me go. When I first arrived in Salvador, the air was so dense with humidity that it felt like you could drink it. My hair curled against my will, and every step from the taxi to the Airbnb made my clothes stick to my skin. I'd never been to Brazil before, and everything about the city, its colors, the songs drifting from open windows, the uneven stone streets, felt sharp and new. The apartment I rented was in an old colonial house, painted blue and white with tall iron gates and a narrow staircase that led to a private entrance on the second floor. The host, a cheerful man named Paulo, greeted me with a quick handshake and a stack of local restaurant flyers. Qualquer cosa, mi diga, he said, pointing to his number scribbled on a fridge magnet. The neighborhood is quiet, but if you need anything, I live upstairs. Inside, the space was cool and dim, a relief from the glare of the street. The high ceilings and tall windows gave everything a sense of faded elegance. But there were signs of age everywhere. Cracked tile, paint flaking above the door, the soft scent of old wood and cleaning products. I let my suitcase drop by the couch and wandered from room to room, trying to memorize the way the shadows shifted with the afternoon sun. There was one window in particular that caught my attention, a narrow, old-fashioned frame looking out over a shared terrace lined with potted plants and empty chairs. The terrace itself was separated from the street by a rusted iron fence and a row of palm trees that swayed in the sticky breeze. I stood there for a while, watching a white cat drift lazily from one pot to the next, the city's noise drifting up in waves. That first night, I tried to settle in. I unpacked, took a lukewarm shower, and made a simple dinner with groceries Paulo had left in the fridge. The fan over the bed rattled and hummed, nearly drowning out the sounds from outside. Music, laughter, the occasional burst of shouting from somewhere down the block. I told myself the chaos was part of the city's charm. Sometime after midnight, as I was drifting into a shallow, uneasy sleep, I heard the faint creak of footsteps on the terrace outside my window, not hurried, but slow, almost deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, the scrape of a shoe on tile, the rustle of a potted plant being brushed aside. I wanted to believe it was Paulo or maybe a neighbor coming home late, but as I listened, the footsteps stopped directly in front of my window, and the air on the other side of the glass felt suddenly colder despite the heat. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Eventually, the footsteps drifted away, fading into the night, replaced by the steady buzz of insects and the distant pulse of samba from the square. I lay awake for a long time after that, listening for any sign that whoever or whatever had been outside might return. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the footsteps, that it was just the echo of a cat moving across the terrace, or a trick of the old wooden beams settling in the tropical heat. Still, as soon as the sun rose, I found myself peering out the narrow window, scanning the potted plants and chairs for any sign that someone had been there. Everything looked untouched, except for one small detail. A single palm frond lay snapped across the tiles, its broken edge pointing directly toward my window. Breakfast helped steady my nerves. I made coffee, sliced mango from the fridge, and tried to focus on my work, video calls, and endless emails from my office back in London. During a break, I wandered onto the terrace, acting casual, hoping I'd bump into Paulo or one of the neighbors. But the terrace was empty, just the white cat, watching me from beneath a table, its green eyes half closed in the sunlight. Around noon, Paulo knocked on my door with a package that had been delivered to the wrong address. He asked how my first night had gone, and I hesitated before answering. "It was fine, just getting used to the sounds," I said, not wanting to sound paranoid. He smiled, shrugged, and told me the terrace was safe, but to always keep the windows locked at night. "People come and go, but nothing bad ever happens here." The rest of the day passed in a blur of work and errands. By evening, the city's noise returned, music, laughter, motorcycles, and I felt almost normal. But as night crept in and the shadows lengthened, I found myself checking the window again and again, making sure the latch was secure. That night, I lay in bed listening to the fan and the distant shouts from the street. Midnight came and went. I was just beginning to relax when I heard it again. Footsteps on the terrace, slow and purposeful, stopping just beneath my window. This time, the footsteps didn't leave. I heard a faint tapping against the glass. 3 times, deliberate, like someone was making sure I was awake. I held my breath, paralyzed by fear and curiosity, staring into the darkness on the other side of the pane. I thought about calling Paolo, but the phone was in the other room and I couldn't bring myself to move. The tapping stopped, and for a long moment the silence felt heavier than the night before. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading into the far corner of the terrace. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for the sound to return, but it never did. When the sun rose, I found another palm frond pressed flat against the window, as if it had been placed there by an unseen hand. I woke late that morning, groggy and restless, the memory of the tapping still ringing in my ears. I lingered by the window for a long time, staring at the palm frond on the sill, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the cat. But deep down I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had placed it there, as if marking territory or leaving a sign just for me. Work felt impossible. My concentration scattered every time a shadow passed across the floor or the fan clicked overhead. When a neighbor's child burst out laughing in the courtyard, I jumped so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. I kept glancing at the terrace, half expecting to see a face peering in or another frond mysteriously moved. Just after lunch, I decided to step outside and get some air. The terrace was empty, drowsy in the afternoon heat. I bent down to move the palm frond away from the window, but as I did, I noticed something new. A small piece of paper, folded and tucked beneath the flower pot closest to my wall. It was almost invisible, a sliver of white against the cracked blue tile. Hands shaking, I unfolded it. The note was written in careful, slightly slanted Portuguese. Você não está sozinho. You are not alone. The words sent a chill up my spine. My first instinct was to go upstairs and confront Paolo, or at least ask if anyone else had access to the terrace. But when I found him in the hallway, he was talking animatedly on the phone and simply waved as I passed. I lost my nerve. Instead, I texted a friend back in London, half laughing about my haunted Airbnb and sending a picture of the note. She replied with a string of ghost emojis, but told me to stay alert and maybe keep the window locked just in case. The rest of the day passed slowly. Every time I walked past the window, I checked for new notes or signs of tampering. Nothing changed. By dusk, I tried to tell myself it was all some weird prank or misunderstanding. A bored kid, a neighbor with a strange sense of humor. But as the sky turned purple and the city's music started up again, the apartment felt emptier than ever. That night, I piled a chair and my suitcase against the window, more for comfort than real protection. I tried to sleep, but every sound from the terrace made me flinch. At some point, I dreamed that a woman in a long skirt stood outside my window, her face hidden, bracelets jingling softly in the breeze. When I woke, heart racing, I realized the tapping had returned. Softer this time, almost gentle, as if reminding me that I hadn't imagined anything. I didn't open the window again until morning. The next day felt endless. I tried to fill the hours with anything that kept my mind from drifting back to the note, the tapping, the palm fronds. I swept the kitchen twice, reorganized my suitcase, answered old emails, and even attempted a Portuguese crossword Paulo had left on the table. But nothing could completely block out the weight of the apartment's silence, or the persistent feeling that I was being watched. As the afternoon faded into evening, a heavy storm rolled in from the bay. Thunder shook the window panes and rain hammered the terrace, turning the tiles slick and shiny under the streetlights. For a while, the noise was a relief, drowning out every other sound. But when the storm tapered off, the quiet that followed seemed even deeper, almost predatory. I made dinner and forced myself to eat, even though my stomach was twisted with nerves. I kept checking the window, making sure it was locked, peering out at the terrace whenever lightning flashed. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, a shape near the potted plants, the white cat darting out of sight. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. Around midnight, the power flickered and cut out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The only light came from the street lamp outside, its glow fractured by rain on the glass. I grabbed my phone, but the battery was nearly dead. I hesitated in the shadows, listening. That's when I heard it, footsteps again, slow and measured on the wet tile. They stopped beneath my window. This time there was no tapping, no movement, just a long pause, as if whoever was out there was waiting for me to make a sound. The silence stretched on, so thick it felt suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, the distant drip of water from the roof, the soft scuff of something heavy being dragged across the terrace. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Suddenly a sharp clang rang out, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the iron fence that separated the terrace from the street. I flinched, heart in my throat, and watched as a sliver of shadow moved past the window, vanishing into the darkness. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. When the lights finally flickered back to life, I mustered the courage to approach the window. Rain streaked the glass, and in the reflected glow of the street lamp, I saw something new. A handprint, smudged and damp, right at eye level on the outside. Shaken, I drew the curtains closed and sat on the bed until morning, sleep impossible, convinced that every creak and sigh of the old apartment was a message meant just for me. I barely slept as dawn crept into the apartment, the light turning everything a faint, ghostly blue. My thoughts ran in circles, trying to rationalize the handprint, the note, the footsteps, but always coming back to the same uneasy truth. Something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I felt like a trespasser in my own rental, watched by eyes I couldn't see. By mid-morning, I had decided to leave. I messaged Paolo, thanking him for everything and explaining, half-truthfully, that a work emergency meant I'd be checking out early. He sent a quick reply, wishing me well and promising to reset the terrace key box for the next guest. The normality of his tone made the last few nights seem even stranger, like a fever dream I couldn't shake. I packed quickly, deliberately leaving the note on the table and the palm frond on the windowsill, as if returning them to whatever presence had left them. My suitcase rattled down the narrow staircase, echoing in the silent house. I paused at the bottom, hand on the gate, and looked back one last time. The terrace was empty, but the white cat watched from beneath a table, tail flicking slowly, eyes bright in the shade. I stepped into the blinding light of the street, feeling the thick humidity settle over me like a second skin. Even with the sun out, I couldn't rid myself of the sensation that someone was still standing just behind the fence, waiting for the apartment to be empty again. As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a new message. No number, no text, just a photo. My breath caught as I opened it. The image was of the terrace outside my window, taken from the exact spot where I'd seen the handprint the night before. In the foreground, a palm frond was pressed flat against the glass, and behind it, blurred but unmistakable, was the faint outline of a woman standing just out of the frame. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at the screen. For a long moment, I wanted to turn back, to check the terrace, to prove to myself that it had all been a trick of nerves and sleeplessness. But I didn't. Instead, I kept walking, the city's noise closing around me, and left the apartment, and whatever waited behind that window, to someone else. I came to Florianopolis at the tail end of the tourist season, hoping the quiet beaches and humid mornings would help me escape the echo of my old life in Manchester. My Portuguese was still shaky, and most of what I knew about the island came from grainy YouTube vlogs and half-remembered conversations with friends who'd been here once for Carnival. The Airbnb listing had promised privacy and ocean sounds at night. The host, Joao, messaged me in a friendly mix of English and Portuguese, assuring me that the house was safe, the area tranquilo, and the nearest neighbor far enough away to let you hear your own thoughts again. It sounded ideal. After a long bus ride, I arrived at dusk. The air tasted of salt and rain, and the small lane leading to the house was lined with tangled wildflowers and the occasional burst of graffiti. The property itself was simple, a squat, whitewashed house with blue trim, perched at the edge of a dune and half hidden by wind-bent palm trees. João had left the keys in a lockbox by the gate, along with a faded map of the area and a handwritten note. "Enjoy the peace. Don't forget to close the shutters at night." Inside, the house was brighter than I expected. White walls, driftwood shelves, a long wooden table pushed beneath an open window. The place smelled faintly of sunscreen, old coffee, and the sea. I wandered from room to room, feeling the floorboards creak underfoot, listening to the distant boom of waves hitting the rocks below. I unpacked slowly, savoring the quiet, trying to convince myself that all the noise and restlessness I'd left behind was truly gone. As darkness settled, I made tea, opened my laptop, and checked the Wi-Fi, surprisingly fast. I stood by the open kitchen window, letting the ocean breeze fill the room, and watched the last orange traces of sunset fade behind a bank of clouds. It felt safe, almost like I was on the edge of the world, finally alone. Later, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard a faint sound from outside, like metal rattling against metal, muffled by the wind. I paused, toothbrush in hand, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time sharper, closer, as if someone were jostling the lockbox at the gate. I turned off the bathroom light and peered through the blinds. The yard was empty, the gate just a dark outline against the sand. I told myself it was nothing, the wind maybe, or the old metal shifting in the cool night air. But as I lay in bed, the house too quiet and too unfamiliar, I kept listening for the sound. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined footsteps crunching through the sand outside, or a hand fumbling for the keys I'd already used. By the time I finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, I was certain I'd left the world behind. But part of me wondered who or what might still be out there, wandering the dunes. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, warm and golden, making the house feel almost cheerful. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that I'd been foolish the night before, that it really had just been the wind or the house settling in the night. I made strong coffee, wandered barefoot onto the sand behind the house, and let the brine and cool air wake me up. Even the lockbox at the gate looked innocent in the morning light, its surface glinting with dew. I tried to throw myself into my routine, answered emails, took a work call, and made a list of local sites I wanted to visit, but every time I paused, a low anxiety crept back in. I found myself checking the window locks and glancing at the gate more than I wanted to admit. A delivery van rumbled by around midday, but otherwise the street was empty. Occasionally I'd hear voices drifting over the dunes from the direction of the beach, but they faded quickly, as if swallowed by the ocean. In the afternoon, I walked to the small grocery store up the road. The shopkeeper greeted me with a wide smile and tried out some English. We chatted about the neighborhood, and when I asked if the area was safe, she just shrugged and said, "Quiet, but sometimes people walk at night, better to lock up." Back at the house, I double-checked the gate and made sure the lockbox was firmly closed. The rest of the evening was calm, even pleasant. I cooked, streamed a show, and let myself believe that I was finally relaxing. But as darkness fell, the mood shifted. The ocean sounded louder, almost restless, and the wind made the shutters rattle even when they were closed. Around midnight, I settled in bed and tried to read, but I kept pausing at every creak and sigh of the old house. That's when I heard it, a faint, deliberate rattle at the gate, much clearer than before. I sat up, every muscle tensed, listening as the metallic sound repeated, slow, steady, purposeful. This wasn't the wind. Someone or something was trying the lockbox. I got up quietly, moving through the darkened house with only my phone's screen for light. Peeking through the blinds, I saw nothing but shadows and the pale sand beneath the moon. The rattle stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy I could hear my own heart pounding. I waited for a long time before returning to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of footsteps circling the house and a hand brushing against the outside wall, searching for a way in. When I woke at dawn, the lockbox looked untouched. But in the sand just outside the gate, I saw a single, fresh footprint pointing toward the water. I spent most of that day on edge, unable to shake the image of the footprint in the sand. I must have circled the house a dozen times, searching for any other marks, but the wind had already erased everything except that single print. It pointed straight from the gate toward the shoreline, as if someone, or something, had come from the ocean and paused at my door. I called Joao, the host, trying to sound casual as I asked if anyone else had access to the house or the lockbox. He laughed softly. "So you, amigo. Maybe a neighbor looked, but nobody uses that path at night. Don't worry, it's tranquilo." His reassurance was meant to calm me, but it only made the silence inside the house feel heavier. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself by walking the empty beach. The sand was cold and smooth, broken only by lines of seaweed and tiny crabs scuttling toward the water. As I walked back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following or waiting by the house. Back inside, I forced myself to work, but every sound made me flinch. The groan of a floorboard, the creak of the shutters, the sudden gusts of wind rattling the windows. Evening came, bringing with it another layer of anxiety. I made dinner but barely touched it, glancing at the clock every few minutes, dreading the approach of midnight. Just before I started getting ready for bed, I noticed something new outside the front door. A trail of wet sand leading from the gate up to the steps. There, right on the welcome mat, was a folded piece of paper, its edges damp and curling. I hesitated, staring at it for a long time before picking it up. Inside, in rough handwriting, were 3 words in Portuguese. "Você foi do." You were seen. My hands shook as I reread the message. I thought about calling Joao again, but what could I say? That someone was leaving footprints and notes in the night? That I felt watched, even though the house was always empty? I checked the locks, closed the shutters tight, and left every light in the house on. As I tried to settle into bed, I found myself listening for any sound outside. A footstep in the sand, a hand on the window, the metallic click of the lockbox being tried again. Sleep came in short bursts, always broken by dreams of the ocean rising up, flooding the house, and a dark shape standing just beyond the glass, watching. The next day brought no answers, only more questions and a gnawing sense of being boxed in by my own caution. I barely left the house, spending hours pacing from window to window, checking the gate, peering through the blinds to see if the sand showed any new marks. The sky stayed heavy and gray, pressing down on the dunes like a warning. Even the ocean sounded different. Restless, distant thunder echoing off the rocks. I tried to call Joao again, but this time he didn't pick up. I left a message about the note and the footprints, hesitating before I hit send, not wanting to sound crazy. While I waited for a response, I kept myself busy with chores, swept sand out of the hallway, rearranged the books on the shelf, made coffee I barely drank. But even in the middle of these ordinary tasks, I felt the weight of someone watching from just outside the glass. As the day faded and the world outside turned blue and silent, I noticed a new detail. One of the shutters in the back bedroom was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed and locked it the night before. A cold draft seeped in through the crack, bringing with it the sharp scent of seaweed and something else, something chemical and unfamiliar. My heart pounded as I approached, examining the latch. It was scratched, as if someone had tried to force it. The sill was gritty with sand, and just outside on the windowsill was a single, wet seashell. Its spiral chipped, its surface marked with a strange, reddish stain. I shut and locked the shutter, then went through the rest of the house, checking every window and door, pushing chairs and suitcases up against the more vulnerable points. I turned on every light, as if illumination alone could keep whatever was outside at bay. The night dragged on, every hour stretching into the next. The wind howled against the house, making the walls groan. Around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Soft, then deliberate, stopping just outside the back bedroom. I froze, every muscle tense, not daring to move or breathe. There was a pause, followed by a slow, scraping sound at the window. Then silence. I stared into the darkness, waiting for the sound to return, but it never did. When the sun finally rose, I found another seashell on the welcome mat. This one cracked in half, its inside hollow and glistening with seawater. By morning, my nerves were frayed. The seashells, the footprints, the message, and the persistent feeling of being watched had turned the little white house into a prison of anxieties. I packed my bag in silence, pausing after each item as if expecting a knock on the door or a new note to slide under the mat. I checked my phone. No message from Joao, no calls, nothing but the sound of the wind battering the window. Before leaving, I did one final walk through the house, checking every lock, glancing into each room. In the back bedroom, the shutter was closed and secure, but the sand beneath the window was disturbed, as if something had been dragged in a slow arc from the sill to the garden path. On the floor by the door, I found another shell, its spiral filled with sand and a small scrap of paper curled inside. With trembling hands, I unrolled the note. In the same rough handwriting, "Você não pode ficar a casa." You cannot close the house. That phrase echoed in my head as I wheeled my suitcase to the gate. The lockbox felt heavier than before, almost sticky with salt. I returned the keys, snapped the box shut, and hurried down the lane without looking back. My footsteps seemed loud in the emptiness, the sand swallowing any echo. As I reached the main road, my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. The image was blurry, as if taken through a rain-streaked window. It showed the house at night, porch lights glowing, and a shadow standing just outside the back bedroom window. In the bottom corner of the image, seashells were scattered across the sand, forming a crude, broken circle. I stood there, heart racing, the sea roaring somewhere behind me. I wanted to believe it was all a mistake, a coincidence, a prank. But as I turned away from the dunes and toward the busy street, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house would remain open, waiting for whoever or whatever came next.